Hello everybody. My name is Brigid Schulte, and I'm a journalist, an author, and a storyteller. And I have been driven my life by one question, and that is, how can we live a good life? How can we make a fair and equitable world possible across race, across class, across gender? How can we make that possible for all people? How can we have time for meaningful work, for love, care, and connection, and even time for joy, leisure, and play? Work should be good work, defined by the three principles of meaning, fairness, and cooperation. And I was still at work. My desk was piled with work, with files, books, coffee spilled every which way. It was not like this desk. This is way too clean. It was also much darker. There was a pint of mint chocolate chip ice cream that was already eaten with a spoon in it right by my computer mouse. My shoulder started to hurt, my butt was asleep, and then I started to feel dizzy and short of breath. And then my chest felt like it was on fire. So the next day I went to the cardiologist. I was not having a heart attack, but they found that the entire lining of my ribs was inflamed, likely brought on by acute stress. So in 1973, psychoanalyst Alan Wheelis published a small book, How People Change. And he outlined 5 steps of transformation. And if I didn't know it before, I knew in this moment, this is exactly what I needed to do. How could I change? And the very first step was to recognize that I was suffering. First step is suffering. Clearly, I was suffering. It felt like I was always working, or that if I wasn't working, I should be working. I was always thinking about working. I was worrying about working. I was guilty if I wasn't working. My husband would come on the weekends and poke his head into my office and say, hey, you want to go on a hike? And I would always turn him down. And he would leave and turn and over his shoulder say, well, aren't you the one that says that people should play? Well, it's true. I knew better, right? I wrote an entire book called Overwhelmed about how people can and should find time for work, love, and play. And yet here I was, working all the time. I run a nonprofit program called the Better Life Lab. It is my job to try to figure out how people can make time for equitable, fair work, love, and play. Yeah, I was supposed to know better. After writing Overwhelmed, I recognized that so much of the pain and misery and suffering in particularly in the United States, I felt like it originated in work culture. And I wanted to understand why and how to change it. But I had no idea. I had no idea how to do that, nor how to change myself. I knew that I had heavy work-life conflict, like most people do. Heavy work demands, even though my children were older. I had heavy life demands as well. And now I was also dealing with my mother in her 90s and trying to help prepare her those bitter waters navigating for end-of-life care. We talk about the unpaid work of care and home. My husband and I were actually doing better than the story that I told in Overwhelmed, where he left me at 2 p.m. cooking Thanksgiving dinner for 18 people while he went and drank a beer with friends. So we were better. We had made a lot of progress, but I was still doing a lot of that unpaid work of care and home. Most women are, around the globe, women do 2 to 10 times the amount of unpaid work and care. And Oxfam has said that that shadow work is worth more than $10 trillion every year. This is valuable work, although it's very invisible. At the same time, I was also suffering from what Alison Wynn, a researcher at Stanford, has called work conflict. As our jobs become more complicated, we layer on more and more tasks, and we don't take them off the table. And these days, with more layoffs, we've got fewer and fewer people expected to do more and more. So that led to the next step in Alan Wheelis's Book of Change, which is insight. Let's be honest, I had a choice. I had some measure of control over my own life, and I did seek help. I joined Workaholics Anonymous. I got some help with a therapist. I began to use those strategies that I knew about to try to make more time for family, for taking long walks, for joy. But I know that I'm not the only one suffering, and that there are so many people who don't have choice, who don't have control. So it was time for me to take out my notebook and do some reporting. So Americans in the United States, we work among the longest hours of any advanced economy. Knowledge workers tend to overwork in one job, trying to live up to these ideal worker expectations, where you're always available, always on, and you're work devoted. Low-wage workers tend to overwork in a series of jobs or side hustles, so everyone's overworking. They also must be always available and on call, except they don't get the pay for it. Long work hours and overwork hours are also something that the sociologist Young-Jung Cha has said is also partly responsible for the gender wage gap, or for those with care responsibilities. You simply cannot put in those long work hours to compete or to survive. And yet the ironic thing is that even with all of those long work hours, if you look per hour, GDP per hours worked, we're not the most productive. We're in there right about with France. And people in America love to hate on France. One of the big reasons why we work such long hours is that we are one of the few advanced economies that have absolutely no guarantee of paid time off of work at all. No paid annual leave, no paid vacation days, which is what this slide shows, no paid sick days, no paid family and medical leave. You know, our policies show what we value and what we consider important. And so in the United States, it shows what we value is work. At the same time, I began noticing these trends that I called the crapification of work. Over the last 40 or 50 years, what had once been good middle-class jobs, solid jobs, had all pretty much disappeared for a variety of reasons, replaced with low-wage service jobs. And I think what a lot of people don't recognize, and I certainly was surprised, 44% of the US workforce is considered low wage. And those who work the lowest wages, 2/3 of them are women, many of them women of color. You know, the General Accounting Office, the GAO, they put out a report, and they found that 70% of the people who qualify for Medicaid or for food and nutrition benefits all work full-time. So what does that tell you? It tells you that these workers are not lazy or just need to work harder. It tells you that the jobs aren't big enough to support human life. So we're working harder and harder and falling further and further behind. At one point, starting at the end of the Second World War up until about the 1970s, when productivity rose, so did worker wages. But that all changed in the 70s. And if you look, the average wage adjusted for inflation, it hasn't budged since the 1980s. At the same time, costs have risen: healthcare, childcare, housing. So workers are working harder and harder, and they are not enjoying the fruits of their labor. CEOs are. So at one time, CEOs made 30 times the average salary of the average worker, and these days the average is 400 times, and in some cases 1,000 times. Or if you're Elon Musk, I don't know how many more times that is. At the same time, we've got a sort of an epidemic of work stress. Gallup just put out its latest state of the global workforce, and workers in the United States and Canada report the highest levels of stress of any economy. 57% say that they are stressed at work every day. Jeff Pfeffer, a professor at Stanford, and his colleagues, they put together a meta-analysis of more than 200 work stress and health studies. And what they found is that there are 10 psychosocial stressors, like work-life conflict, job insecurity, long work hours, that they create so much stress, so much acute and chronic illness, that the way we work has become the 5th leading cause of death in the United States. Now, I may not have had a heart attack that late night with the ice cream, but a lot of people are. So then it was time to think. Well, so what did all of that mean? You know, it felt like these were problems that were so huge, I didn't know how to change them. It felt, this is just, so many people felt that this is just the way things are. And I realized, you know, we have this sense that the problems are individual. So if you're burned out, you just need to take a bath. You know, the solutions are also aimed at the individual. You know, just here's a lunchtime yoga or have a meditation app, and then this will all be fine. But it's not. We need individual solutions, yes, but I realized we also needed organizational solutions. We need policy solutions. We need to have all three of those. A friend of mine sent me to her cabin in Tennessee, and she wouldn't let me come home until I had finished my book proposal. So I did, and then COVID hit. And so in March of 2020, I sold my book proposal for a book that was going to be called Overworked. And my publisher called me in April of 2020 and said, 20 million people are unemployed. We can no longer call this book Overworked. And so we decided to put a space in between the two words, overwork, because what was clear is that we were done. We were done with the way things had always been. And so much was changing so fast. Work from home, flexible work. The hourly workers that had once been so invisible were now considered essential and heroes. I was wondering, could things really stick? I needed to know how things could change. And at the end of every Workaholics Anonymous meeting, I don't think I'm giving away too much, there's a petition, an ask for strength and hope. And that's what I realized I needed to do, and led me to the next stage in the journey to transformation, which is will. And that was trying to find the stories of the change agents who, through hope and persistence and will, sheer force of will, were learning from their suffering and insight and actually working to change work. I'll share just 3 stories. So we know the burnout epidemic is huge. The World Health Organization in 2019 described burnout as a serious occupational phenomenon. In nowhere is it more intense than in the health and medical profession. 1 in 2 doctors experience at least one symptom of burnout, and this was long before COVID. Doctors and nurses have among the highest suicide rates of any profession. And so I met a man called Corey Feist, and he had lost a beloved family member who had gotten sick during COVID and had a mental breakdown. And because they were so worried about seeking mental health treatment, because they worried it would make them, they would lose their license, they would lose the credential that enabled them to practice medicine, something that they had dedicated their life to, that she took her own life. And so Corey Feist and his family, they founded the Dr. Lorna Breen Heroes Foundation. And they are working and making a huge difference. They're working to reduce paperwork, administrative burdens that so many doctors, they call it pajama time. They have to work so late to do it. They're working, astoundingly, they got a bipartisan bill passed through Congress in 18 months with $135 million to search for and disseminate best practices for how to really change systems. And finally, what they're working on is they're working with state medical boards, and 25 and counting have changed their licensing requirements so that it will no longer be a stigma to seek mental health treatment if you're feeling burned out. You won't lose your license. And what Corey told me is that we don't need more resilient canaries. We need to build new coal mines. This is Ashley Worthen. She started as a cashier at Albertsons grocery store in Eugene, Oregon, just out of high school. She didn't know what work was supposed to be like, so she didn't know that when she had chaotic hours, she had no idea when she would work, how often she would work. When her paycheck swung wildly, even though her bills didn't, she thought that's just the way things were. And then she started talking with other workers, and then she joined her union, and then together they fought for fair and predictable schedules. And now Ashley's family has so much more stability. She's able to find childcare for her son, so that's enabled her mother to go back to work because her mother was held hostage by that unpredictable schedule. And what Ashley told me is that everyone is healthier and happier, and the work is better at their store. Oregon passed the very first statewide stable schedules law, and other cities and organizations are doing the same thing. So I find that very hopeful. And the last story I'm going to tell is set in Japan. I went there to try to understand how can you change a culture where overwork is so ingrained that they have a word, karoshi, for dying from overwork. And I found family members who had lost loved ones, labor lawyers, unions, advocates, young people. I went to this protest, and one of the young advocates said, "We just want a decent life." And one of the loudest voices asking for change or calling for change is Tetsuyo Ando, who runs an organization called Fathering Japan. And it's fathers who are calling for an end to the overwork culture, because they want time for care and connection. They don't want to overwork to the point of death. They want lives as well. And what Tetsuya told me is that when fathers change, families change, then communities change, then companies change, then society changes. So he went from the individual all the way to the societal, and they're making a difference. They're suing companies and winning, they're getting legislation, they're using media pressure to really try to push for change. And that leads to the next step in this transformation journey, which is action, take action. And I realized that through all of this reporting that I'd done, I realized three things. Number one, we need to think about work in a much bigger way. That work is not only what we do for pay, but it's also the unpaid work of care and home. Two, all of that work should be good work, defined by the three principles of meaning, fairness, and cooperation. And finally, that change is possible. It all comes down to the stories we choose to believe. And it's time for a new story of work. So the way things are don't have to be the way things will be. Now when my husband asks me to go for a hike on the weekend, I turn off my computer and I go. The future is a choice, and it will be up to all of us to imagine a better future of work, to believe that it's possible, and then use our suffering, learn from our insight, draw on our will, and take action. And then we'll get to transformation. Thank you.